Well, I'm working on an old Toro today. Yeah, overhead valve GTS, and this has a just a kind of abnormal nowadays carburetor setup and air filter setup. The air filter design is not real great. Um, they tend to let in quite a lot of junk. This was actually zip tied into place, and the filter was totally soaked with all kinds of stuff. So these things start to deform. The plastic just wasn't stiff enough, so that's a major problem. But the carburetor also needs attention, and since there are not that many carburetor videos about older machines like this, I thought, what the heck, I'll do a detailed carburetor rebuild video, and maybe that's helpful to someone. All right, so I got the carb off, of course, and I gave it a quick clean outside in the outdoor sink. The bowl is in pretty corroded, rusty shape. There doesn't seem to be a lot of debris floating around, but um, yeah, one thing you notice about these older carburetors is they seem rather complicated compared to modern ones. And I think that's really just a testament of engineering. You know, when an engineer starts to design something, you know, they have a particular task to accomplish, and there's different ways to do that. And there's different manufacturing processes available with casting and forging and plastics that are, you know, resilient against fuel. Normally, when you get the main jet, a normal screwdriver won't work because it has this tapered shoulder. So I have this one that I've ground down, and you actually have to be kind of careful with these. It's just a, you know, it's just a slotted screwdriver, but it's normally an aluminum housing, and it's normally a brass jet, and they're normally corroded, and you normally, again, need a screwdriver that will get all the way down in there, but then also get a good purchase. So I have found very few screwdrivers off the shelf to do this well, and again, normally it needs to be modified in some way. And really want to take your time because you don't want to mess this up like I'm about to. So I try not to edit out too many of my mistakes. Oh, there we go. It's working. You know, if you're really good at doing this stuff, you're probably not watching this video. And so this video is probably being watched by someone who maybe is doing it for the first time or needs some help. And so I don't like removing all the evidence. Oh, yeah, you can see. So this is an emulsification tube. You can see how much junk is built up on there. Yeah, I don't really like, you know, editing out all my mistakes because there's a good chance I make a mistake that you'll make, and I don't want to make people feel stupid. Okay, now on something like this, you just want to make sure that it can't screw in. I'm going this way before I go this way. In this case, it doesn't, but I'll show you why in a moment with this spring-loaded version. So basically, whenever you see a spring, not in this case, but whenever you see a spring on a screw, what that spring holds tension on it so that it doesn't back out, because you're not going to tighten this down all the way. This is an adjustment needle. So what you want to do is you want to find out what position is it at right now. What I like to do is take a screwdriver with some sort of reference surface like this marking of 23 or the label and place it straight up, and then begin to tighten, okay? And count the revolutions. So that's 1, 2, and it basically has bottomed out now. You want to be careful not to damage the surface where the brass needle touches the aluminum housing, but that's basically 2.5. So you jot that down and remember it. Now completely remove it. If you had just completely removed it, you'd have no idea what position it was in. And so you want to lightly seat it and then back it out to find out what position was it in when you started on the machine. Now that's no guarantee that that's the right position, because someone may have gotten in there with a screwdriver and messed with it to try and solve some problem. But it is a good starting point before you disassemble something and then you don't know, you know, where was the adjustment before I started. So, made in Japan. Mikuni makes very good carbs. So does Kian, both Japanese manufacturers. Same with Walbro and Zama, all really good manufacturers. Okay, so the only thing left to disassemble in here is this. And normally this post on either side of my finger just slides in and out. But it looks like either someone's been in here or maybe at the factory they kind of like knurled it or crimped it. So I'm just going to see what happens if I just do a little tapping. Okay, it is coming out. Sometimes these are directional, so you want to be careful. They only come out one way because they're tapered, or they have like a head, like a head of a nail. There we go, that one's out. It could just be that someone was in there and kind of messed up the edge, so I'll probably sand that. And then this is your float needle. This needle is pretty well covered in junk, so that was worth removing. You don't always have to remove that thing, but it's a good idea too. So that's as far as I'm going to go with the disassembly. There's really no need to remove the throttle or the choke shaft or plate. They're normally not very messed up, and it's generally not worth it. We'll work on cleaning this in a little bit. So yeah, tools of the trade. It's going to be a variety of brushes. You have kind of your standard toothbrush style brush. I like these brushes because you can get kind of down into corners that you normally can't get in with a toothbrush style brush. Also a couple like rifle style brushes. These can be handy for cleaning the passageways, although not that handy because normally big passageways like that are not that messed up. A set of blow torch tip files. You have to be careful with these. These are files. These ridges create little cutting surfaces, so you can actually enlarge a hole if you do this too vigorously. This is a really nice style brush I got on Amazon. It's, as you can see, it's really small, but it's steel, and it allows you to clean similarly as this one, but with a bit more, scratches a bit more. This is one of the most useful tools. This is just one of those aircraft cable keychains, and inside are these very thin but very hard stainless steel wires. And these are the perfect tool, these are the perfect tool for cleaning out these little passageways. Now, these passageways are, in this case, big enough you don't need this, but on two-stroke carburetors, some of the passageways are so small that something like this is too big. Here's your main jet. So all the fuel that makes its way into the engine goes through here. This is very often the thing that's plugged up. I've not examined the schematic on this carburetor, but this would probably be an idle jet. So you can see there's a marking on it. Anyway, fuel would come up through that bottom hole and out through here. And this would be what controls the amount of fuel that gets into the engine at idle. And then this is probably in an adjustment for, again, idle. You can see here at the tip of the cone, I don't know if you can tell, but it looks like there's like a groove in here. It's kind of worn away. So in an ideal world, you'd want to replace that. But on a 30-year-old lawnmower that somebody gave you that you're going to give away to someone in need, you might skip that. You might also have a hard time finding that. But that should be cleaner. And if you really reef down on this thing when you're tightening, you can do that damage or damage to the seat inside the carburetor, which is even worse. So yeah, so you can just start by cleaning all of these things. It's best to use, if you're cleaning brass, it's best to use a brass brush because a steel brush can, because it's harder than the brass, it can damage the brass. Although there are times when certainly I'll use steel, and you just have to be a little bit more aware and cognizant. It's not to say you can't, it's just to say you got to be a little bit more aware of what you're doing. And these things don't need to be polished, but they do need to be clean of debris because that debris will either break off later and get into these orifices or jets or passageways, or it'll dissolve into the fuel and do something similar. So again, when you use this, do it very lightly. Don't go scraping like crazy. What I like to do actually is just put it on there and then spin it. If you do this especially if you put like an angle on it, again, you can file these holes to larger sizes. And these are specific sizes chosen by the manufacturer, and you don't want to go modifying them. So I like to do it just as you see. Just give them a quick spin. I mean, really, just pushing this in and out is generally enough. And then rotate 90 degrees and do the rest. Now, sometimes you're pushing debris from a hole into the body of this thing, so you want to give it a good rinse afterwards. And you can even see I've pushed out some debris there. So sometimes you got to clean a couple times. Again, you want to clean inside of here. A little rifle brush, well, that one's too big, but a little rifle brush or something is a good choice. Compressed air is a great choice. The kitchen sink and some soap. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to get these things clean. Gasoline is the best solvent. In chemistry, there's a phrase, like dissolves like. And so most of the contaminants that are in here are basically leftover petroleum, basically sediment, you could call it. You want to hold that up to the light, make sure all the holes are clear, like you can see here, hopefully. It looks like that one's still a little bit plugged up. And again, compressed air, carb spray, things like that. So I'll do the final cleaning off camera. I'll just spray that with compressed air and a little bit of carb clean, things like that. Okay, this post, so you can see there's a little flat spot in this post. So sometimes they're directional, as I mentioned, you got to be careful. So we'll clean this little idle jet next. It's a good idea to clean the outside of the car before you get into the center of it, just because, you know, there's no point in cleaning inside and then knocking more junk inside. And the same is true kind of before you try and clean out these tiny jets, just give this thing an overall good cleaning. There's not a lot of sense in cleaning out the tiny passageway and then junk, you know, knocking off a bunch of stuff. But yeah, with these things, you always want to think about, okay, where's the in and the out? You want to get that right, and you want to make sure that you clean all the passageways. Sometimes they're so corroded you can't see them. But this is an example where any of my blowtorch tip cleaners would have been too big for that hole. And then there's nothing up here. It just looks like there could be something up there, but there's no hole up there. All right, and here's the main jet. It's not very common to see a little washer on here. Sometimes you do, but not very often. As I mentioned, this carburetor, compared to ones that are on this for sale right now, I mean, it's relatively complicated. There's just a lot more pieces. It took them more components to achieve the same results that they achieve now. And a lot of stuff now is made out of plastic. And with injection molding, like an injection molded carburetor, you can injection mold passageways that were not possible with aluminum casting. And so with aluminum castings, you find more passageways that were drilled and then capped with a brass cap. Whereas nowadays, again, it's just injection molded, super complicated shapes, which allows you to reduce the number of components and all those sorts of things. That's a big plus. With main jets, you normally have this sort of tapered inlet, and those can be pretty difficult to clean. You can use something like this. I mean, that gets in there, but it doesn't agitate or scrape or scratch very well. Something like this works, but at some point this gets all bunched up like that, and it also doesn't work that well. So what I'll do is normally just a bit of this, and then I'll just let it soak in the gasoline while I clean something else for a little while. You want to make sure that your float still floats. So it's pretty uncommon for a plastic one to go bad, but these used to be made out of brass if you're working on an even older machine, and the brass could corrode a little bit, and so they would fill with liquid gasoline and no longer float. And then the complaint in that case would generally be that gas is leaking out of the machine, namely out of the area where the air filter is, because the carb is basically not turning off. So then you have this little, sometimes there's a spring on here, sometimes there's not. Yeah, this is your fuel inlet needle. So basically when that floats in the gasoline, this thing is closed and won't let more gasoline in. Then as the engine consumes that fuel, the little float will drop in the bathtub and open this valve, and it will let fresh fuel in. Sometimes these tips are made out of rubber, and they can go bad. Most of the time, the metal ones do not go bad. I mean, actually, most of the time, none of them go bad. But occasionally they do, so you just want to inspect that. But again, the complaint here would be basically fuel is leaking out of the machine all the time, coming out of the air filter area. That's where you want to look. Okay. A couple other little components I don't think I'll clean here on the screen because it's not that interesting. But basically, you just want to get everything really clean. Any little bits, and basically what you need to think about is, any bit of material that's going to plug up that hole could cause some problems. So you want to, make sure that all of that's off. For something like this, you want to probably use, I mean, it depends on what you have, obviously. You can do this by hand, but what I'm going to use is a wire wheel attached to the drill press. You could do something like this. I have a lot of different brushes that I've found over the years that are useful. So just keep an eye open for them. I'm going to use this, and basically this brush fits right in there. So I'm going to do that off camera, show you the result. All right, that only took about 1 minute. One thing you can do if you're unable to get these things perfectly clean, what I would suggest doing is get them as clean as you can. And then if you get the machine up and running and all of that, that's great. And then after a tank of fuel or something like that, drop this bowl. What will happen is all the vibrations from this machine will kind of shake this thing and chip up, and it'll deposit a bunch of debris down there. And you can basically just, again, I've worked on some that were just horrific, and I wasn't at home to have all my tools to get them perfectly clean. And you can just check them every, tank of gas or whatever, and you can go ahead and clean up. Go ahead and clean up the debris that collects in there, because the debris is heavier than the gasoline, and so the debris typically falls to the bottom of the bowl. It doesn't immediately get sucked up, but then, as you're rocking the machine, or if it's a chainsaw, flipping it upside down, things like that, eventually, that debris will make it into the carburetor jets, and that's when you have problems. But it's not as if it goes there right away. It normally falls to the bottom of the bowl, and so you can let it fall to the bottom of the bowl and just clean out the bowl several times. It's not ideal, but I was in Puerto Rico and basically working with just a couple hand tools, and sometimes that's all you can really do. So, okay, so now most of the components are clean. We'll take a quick look at this guy again, the main jet. I do find that carburetor cleaner seems to break down this stuff a little bit more than gasoline. Obviously, gasoline is extremely cheap comparatively to, a can of carb spray. So I try and use gasoline as much as I can. Some really cool brushes my wife found for me. A couple different sizes. They're like for, I don't know what they're for, but they're nerdy. If your wife gets you miniature brushes for your birthday, she loves you, but you're a nerd. Anyhow, yeah, the point being, you may not have the equipment that you need, and you may have to look for alternative means. Obviously you could have just bought a new carburetor and saved yourself all this headache, but depending on where you are and what kind of access to parts you have, I personally like developing the skills that work overseas in the jungle. Like anyone can go on Amazon and buy a carburetor. And so, you can leave a comment below. Well, I would have just bought a new carburetor. Well, that's fine. I can also buy a new carburetor. But I like to work on the skills where, you know, if you're, my wife and I feel like the Lord might be preparing us to go be missionary somewhere, and if you're in the jungles of Ecuador and there's a chainsaw, you know, you can't just order one on Amazon. So I like developing the kind of skills now when I do have access to Amazon. You know, that would help me. You know, you do make mistakes sometimes. Like I've tried certain repair techniques or cleaning techniques, and I've ruined stuff. Oh, turns out muriatic acid, you know, through that too fast. So it's nice to experiment in low risk situations. It's not fun to experiment, you know, when you're in the jungle or whatever, and you're not sure if something's going to work, and you try it and it doesn't, and all of a sudden you're really in a pickle. So um, I like that experimentation. I like that practice of, okay, yeah, of course I can replace it. Any idiot can replace it, but can I repair it? Can I clean it? Can I, you know, bypass it? And you could say shade tree mechanic or something if you want. That's fine. I'm an ASE certified master mechanic. I worked at Volkswagen for 17 years as an engineer, so I'm not a shade tree mechanic, but I appreciate to some extent shade tree mechanics because, again, anyone can go to the dealership and order a part, and very often that's the right thing to do, you know, for a car or something like that. But sometimes, you know, shade trees, they have like a really great sense of creativity. um, and you might appreciate that creativity if you're out in the bush or that. I had a good friend grow up on the island of Sark in England, where there are no cars, and I just really admired his ability to improvise, to think on his feet, to fix things with nothing but, you know, a hammer and scotch tape. I mean, it was just so cool. I loved that. And I grew up more in a city, a metropolitan area, Metro Detroit, and so I had good access to all kinds of tools and information and parts. But, you know, in some ways, he was a way better problem solver than me because he had come from less. And, you know, we don't normally want less for our children. We want more. But in some ways, less is a wonderful teacher of so many different skills and practices. So, all right, I'm going to do the final cleaning with some compressed air off camera here. Be right back. All right, so reassembly time. One really good tip is to take some carb cleaner with a straw and go into each and every port and spray and make sure it comes out somewhere else. It'll teach you a little bit about how carburetors are, how they function. It'll also make sure that all the passages are clean. You want to be careful doing that with a two-stroke. There are some check valves in two-stroke carburetors that are very delicately built and won't do well with those kinds of forces that come out of the carb spray. But for four strokes like this, it's totally fine. For something like this, a drill is really useful. This is the post, this is the axle. And it's very hard to make things smooth again by hand. But if you chuck it in a drill, then you can get all sorts of shafts and things like that working again real nicely. So we're just going to clean that up. Okay. So I like to be basically, I call it surgically level clean. So I've cleaned all of these passageways out with carb spray, then I've sprayed it with compressed air. The carb body is not 100% perfect, although it's good, and I would say it's good enough. So emulsification tube. Most of these things cannot be installed upside down or backwards without like really stupid forces. So just take your time. It can be a little intimidating to remember what went where. But generally, if you just try things out, you'll realize that it really could only go one way. So if you remember, it was 2.5. So again, I'll just put the label straight up. It's bottomed out lightly. So there's 1, 2.5. Now, again, you don't know that that was right. Somebody could have got in there and made some changes. So you got to take those measurements with a grain of salt, I think is the phrase. And yeah, let's see. We'll drop. Generally, it's easiest to drop that guy in there like that. And I like to hold him, that way he doesn't fall out, which he likes to do. And then get it seated. And then slide in the axle. Again, sometimes this axle is directional, and sometimes these holes are directional. Sometimes these two posts are different sizes. One's a big one, one's a little one. Actually, I think it's exactly what I'm running into right now. So be cautious that you don't jam something. Most of these things don't have to be jammed at all. So, and then I can feel there's still just a little burr on there, so I'm gonna just most of the time the bowl itself is what keeps that axle from falling out. And then this is an odd piece, actually. This is pretty uncommon. This plastic piece keeps the float from falling too far down. Normally it's the bottom of the bowl that does that, but for whatever reason they had that. Those are the kinds of things that engineers eliminate after a certain generation. They reduce the design, they reduce the bill of material while keeping all of the same functions. So sometimes engineers will rush a design. Oops, I forgot that washer. Sometimes engineers will rush a design because they want to be first to market with something, and then you know, for the next model year, for the sake of cars, they'll go through and they'll do some cost cutting. They'll reduce some of the complexity that they had created. Yes, this is kind of an odd design. It's not real common that I see that, but it's okay. Yeah, and then the bowl, and I forgot to clean him and him on the wire wheel, so I'll do that and then reassemble. All right. Sometimes I get a little bit off my game when I'm recording. So these gaskets can kind of be a pain. You can get them pinched. So sometimes it's easier to drop them here and put the bowl on. Other times it's better to put them on the bowl. It just depends. And one thing I really like to use to get things to slide on one another really easily is some petroleum jelly. Because it's a petroleum product, it dilutes into the gasoline, doesn't destroy seals. You want to be careful oiling seals. Certain oil can cause things to swell, so that can be a problem. And it's about to get noisy in my garage here in a moment. Okay. This is a very cheap little screw. I don't think he would last very long. As long as he doesn't leak. If you ever have on the bottom of a carburetor two screws, the one off to the side is the drain. The one through the bottom, like the one I'm touching right now, is what holds it on. And on some carburetors, more modern ones, the main jet is actually in that hold down screw. So if you don't find a main jet, look inside the screw. They incorporate it in there. Also pretty clever design, I think. Take a look around the outside. Make sure your seal is not pinched. If you've never tried some of these Knipex pliers, they are awesome. Put them on your Christmas list. And yeah, that's that little overflow tube here, or vent tube. One thing to be careful of with carburetors, there's a lot of ports that can be exposed to the air, like that one, and that one, and that little hole. But sometimes they're plugged with brass, like that one. And I actually got my butt kicked once on a set of on a Suzuki GSX 600 motorcycle. Had 4 carbs, and they all had a port like this. What I didn't realize is that deep down in that port, they were plugged with brass, except for one of them, because it was supposed to receive a vacuum line that went to the fuel tank petcock. So that totally kicked my butt. So be really careful with those. Just make sure that if they're plugged, if they're supposed to be plugged, they're plugged, and if not, something should attach to them. Sometimes these things deteriorate, fall out, somebody else was in there, and so you never really know what's supposed to go where. So, all right, I hope that was helpful to someone, maybe who's working on something old. I don't know exactly how interesting or helpful these videos are, these longer format detailed ones. So if it was helpful to you, I'd love to hear that. I don't ask for likes on this channel. I only ask for dislikes. So if you're still watching and you didn't like that, give it a dislike. And go check out Donnie Boy or Steve's Small Engine Saloon if you're interested in small engine stuff. Both of those guys have been pretty helpful to me. I've learned quite a lot from them. And they have nice videos. So take care, folks.